I never thought a single late-night phone call during a thunderstorm would rewrite everything I believed about fear, love, and second chances. What started as a routine job turned into a storm-soaked journey of comfort, emotional healing, and a kind of closeness I didn't think people like Oost, weathered souls with baggage, were still allowed to find. This isn't just a story about a storm. It's about what happens when two people discover they're no longer meant to weather life alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had already started when I pulled into the gravel driveway of the house on Elmwood Ridge, the kind of steady, insistent rain that makes you check the seals on your truck windows and turn the radio down to concentrate. It wasn't the job I'd planned for that day, not even close. My schedule was stacked with a kitchen cabinet installation across town, but sometime around 5:40 p.m., my phone buzzed with a name I barely recognized. June Porchlight Lady, it read. A nickname I'd given her after doing a minor electrical fix at her place 3 months back. I didn't remember much about her, only that she'd been polite, paid in cash, and left the porch light on, even during the daytime. Like she needed it for more than just visibility. When I answered, her voice came through in a whisper, shaky and unsure, layered beneath the rumble of thunder. She asked if I was busy, then she said she was terrified. Not because of a broken pipe or an outage, but because she couldn't bear to be alone during storms. She didn't even ask me to fix anything, just wondered if I could stop by. Something in her voice cut through every excuse I had. Maybe it was because I've heard fear like that before, genuine, raw, and tinged with embarrassment. I told her I'd be there in 20 minutes. I didn't even tell her why I was saying yes. I just knew I would. The house stood at the edge of a sleepy hill town in Vermont. A 2-story colonial with white shutters that looked like it had weathered its fair share of winters and maybe even a few heartbreaks. As I stepped out of my truck, I could see her silhouette framed in the window, standing perfectly still, backlit by a flickering lamp. She opened the door before I reached the steps, her hand gripping the knob like she'd been waiting all day just to have someone to turn it for. June was 58. She wore her age like a well-kept dire creases around her eyes, a streak of silver in her tied-back hair, but her posture was deliberate, almost proud. She smiled, apologetic but grateful, and waved me in. The smell of lemon tea and old wood filled the air. A dog-eared book sat open on the table beside a half-empty mug. There was no obvious emergency, nothing that would normally justify a call to a handyman at dinner time. But she didn't need a fix-it, was something else entirely. I sat at the edge of the floral couch while she lit another candle. The power hadn't gone out, but she said she liked the feeling of light during storms. It reminded her of her mom, who always kept candles on hand, not for utility but for warmth. June didn't say much at first. She just paced near the window, occasionally glancing at me like she was checking to make sure I hadn't vanished. I didn't pressure her. I knew better than to fill the silence too quickly. Sometimes the quiet says more than conversation ever could. Eventually, she asked if I'd mind staying a little while. Not to talk, not even to be in the same room, but just so she knew someone else was in the house. I told her I didn't mind. I didn't tell her I'd cleared the rest of my night the second she said she was scared. I didn't tell her I was curious, too, about her life, her solitude, her strength, wrapped in that quiet voice. The thunder cracked again, and the lights flickered. She flinched. I offered to check the breaker just to feel useful. She nodded but didn't follow me. In the basement, everything looked fine. I lingered longer than I had to, mostly to give her space. When I returned upstairs, she was in the kitchen, pouring another cup of tea. This time, she offered one for me. We sat in the living room, the storm forming a soundtrack behind us, and slowly, words started to fill the space. She told me she hadn't always been afraid of storms. In fact, she used to love them until one night 10 years ago, when her husband collapsed during a blackout and the ambulance didn't make it in time. Since then, every thunderclap reminded her of the moment the world became unrecognizable. There was no theatrical sobbing, no dramatic unraveling, just a quiet confession, a memory she let out like a long breath. I didn't try to fix it. I just listened. That night, I stayed until the rain let up and she seemed calmer. We didn't talk much more, just shared presence. Before I left, she asked if she could call me again if the storm came back. Said of course, not realizing how much I already meant it. As I drove away, I glanced at her porch light still on, just like before, but this time it didn't seem like a crutch. It seemed like a promise. The next morning, even though the skies had cleared and the storm had moved on, I found myself unable to stop thinking about June. Not in the way you think when someone leaves a dramatic impression or says something unforgettable, but more like the way a melody lingers even after the song ends. Her house, the warm tea, the dim candlelight, and her soft but deliberate voice all played in a loop in my mind, refusing to quiet down. I've been in and out of dozens of homes over the years, some spotless, some chaotic, some filled with laughter and others with silence. But there was something different about hers. The silence in June's house wasn't empty. It was waiting for something. Or someone. Work was waiting for me too, though. A porch railing job out in Fairfield and a faucet replacement in the afternoon. I loaded the truck like I always did, mentally running through tools, screws, sandpaper, epoxy. Still, every time my mind tried to settle into the rhythm of the day, it kept drifting back to June standing in that living room. Her hands wrapped around that mug like it was the last thing anchoring her to the moment. I told myself I was just being thoughtful, that maybe I'd follow up in a few days. But by early evening, the clouds had started gathering again, and the radar on my phone looked worse than it had 24 hours before, and before I could talked myself out of it, I was back behind the wheel, heading up that winding ridge road like it was part of my daily route. When I pulled up to her driveway, I didn't even have to knock. She was already at the door, wearing a cardigan this time, her hair tied up looser than before. There was something in her eyes when she saw me. Not surprise, not even relief, more like recognition, like she'd hoped I might come back, but hadn't let herself believe it. She invited me in again, quieter this time, her voice steadier, but her fingers twitching slightly as she closed the door behind us. The air inside smelled of cinnamon and something floral. A candle flickered again in the corner, not out of necessity, but perhaps out of ritual. This time, she had music playing softly on a small radio instrumentals, something piano-based. I didn't ask what it was, but it set a tone that made everything feel a little more lived in. We sat at the kitchen table this time instead of the living room, and I could see she'd set out 2 mugs in anticipation. I wondered if she'd set them out long before the clouds rolled in, just in case. She talked more that night. It's about the town, the way the seasons changed, how she used to volunteer at the community center. She told me about the children's reading hours she used to organize before everything became too noisy, too much. She spoke like someone who had once lived a very loud life and was now rediscovering the peace and softness. I told her a bit more. About myself, too. How I started fixing things because it kept my hands busy after my dad passed. How I'd stayed single longer than I intended because routines were easier than risk. She nodded like she understood something unsaid. We didn't linger too long on our losses. They hung in the room like old wallpaper. Familiar and always visible if you looked hard enough. It started raining again around 8 p.m. Light at first, but the kind that drums against windows. With a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. June's hand flinched just once when a crack of lightning lit up the kitchen. I didn't say anything. I just reached over and turned the radio up slightly, enough to mask the next round of thunder. She noticed, and though she didn't thank me out loud, her eyes softened in appreciation. We sat like that for a long while. No rush, no agenda. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes company means more when it's not trying to fix you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At one point, she stood up and said she wanted to show me something. She disappeared upstairs and came back with a small beat-up journal. She said it had been her late husband's storm diary, something he used to keep when he couldn't sleep through the wind and thunder. She read me a short passage, one that described a storm just like the one outside. and how it made him feel like time was pausing for just a few hours, holding him in a quiet embrace. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she didn't cry. She just closed the book and placed it on the table like it was too heavy to hold for long. That moment shifted something. It wasn't just about storms anymore. It was about memory, about grief that hides in the spaces between everyday tasks, about how the sound of rain could trigger a whole life's worth of feelings. And I realized something else. Tushy hadn't asked me to come that night. I had shown up uninvited. Somehow, that had made all the difference. When the rain got heavier, I offered to stay until it passed. She didn't say yes or no. Just brought out a folded blanket from the hallway closet and placed it on the living room couch. Not a guest bed, not a bedroom invite. Just a simple gesture of stay, if you want to. So I did. I didn't sleep right away. I lay on that couch, staring at the ceiling while the rain pounded the roof like a soft warning. And I kept thinking how strange it was that comfort could exist in the home of someone you barely knew. That silence between two people could say so much. Not maybe, just maybe, we were both a little less terrified than we used to be. The morning after I spent the night on June's couch, I woke to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the soft hum of a kettle on the stove. The storm had passed, leaving behind a gray calm. The kind that makes everything outside look softer somehow, like the world had been rinsed clean but hadn't dried yet. I stretched, sitting up slowly, careful not to disturb the folds of the blanket too much, as if undoing them too harshly would somehow break the stillness of the moment. The living room was lit only by the gentle wash of daylight filtering in through the lace curtains, and I could hear June in the kitchen, moving around deliberately like someone who had already been awake for hours and had decided to let the silence stay a little longer. I stood and folded the blanket the way she had left it for me, placing it neatly back on the couch's armrest. I hadn't meant to stay the night. I hadn't planned for it. But something about her quiet acceptance of my presence made it feel less like an intrusion and more like something that had simply made sense. As I stepped into the kitchen, June was standing at the counter, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs, one green, one chipped blue, and she handed me the blue one like she already knew it was more my style. She didn't say good morning or ask how I slept. She just offered the cup with a soft smile and a nod, as if this too had been expected. We stood there for a while, sipping in silence. Outside, the trees were still dripping, the leaves heavy. With last night's rain, the sky was pale and swollen with leftover clouds. June glanced toward the window and then, without looking at me, said that it had been years since someone had stayed the night in that house. Not since her husband passed. Her voice didn't carry any sadness, at least not the kind that demands comfort. It was more like a fact, a memory she had long since folded and put away neatly, but hadn't forgotten. I told her I should probably get going soon. I had jobs lined up and a few reschedules because of the weather. She didn't protest. Didn't try to keep me, just nodded again and said thank you. Not for fixing anything, just for being there. There was something in her gratitude that lingered even after I left, something deeper than politeness. It stayed with me as I drove down the hill, as the town started to wake up, as I stopped at the hardware store for supplies. It had a quiet gravity to it, the kind that pulls you in without force. I went back to my routine that week, but things didn't quite feel the same. My work took me across different neighborhoods, into homes filled with clutter, laughter, tension, and occasionally chaos. But none of them echoed the way hers did. None of them made me wonder what the person living there might be thinking when the lights were off and the rain was tapping against the windows. It wasn't that I was obsessed or smitten. It wasn't even romantic in the way most people think. It was more like I had crossed into a part of someone's world where very few people had been invited lately. And now I couldn't stop wondering, what else lived in that quiet space between storms? About a week later, another storm rolled through. This one was shorter, less intense, more bark than bite. But even before the first thunderclap, I found myself checking the forecast compulsively, wondering if June was watching the radar too. I told myself she was fine, that she'd gotten through the last one and would be okay again. But I also told myself that it wouldn't hurt to just check in. Not a visit, just a call, just to say hello. "So I did," she answered on the third ring, her voice calm but surprised. I asked how she was holding up. She said she was doing better this time, had lit a candle already, and was halfway through a puzzle she'd been working on since spring. I offered to stop by if she needed anything. She paused for a moment before saying she wouldn't mind some company. I said it in the same tone someone might use to invite a friend for coffee, casual but purposeful. I didn't hesitate. That visit was different. The fear wasn't as thick in the air, and June seemed lighter somehow, like the act of surviving one storm with someone by her side had peeled away a layer of weight she'd been carrying alone for too long. She showed me the puzzling, old-fashioned map of New England, and we worked on it together for an hour, while the wind rattled. The shutters and the rain tapped against the windows like it had a rhythm to keep. She played music again, this time jazz, and even hummed along once or twice. We didn't talk about anything heavy that night. No confessions, no journals, just ordinary things. She told me about the bakery that used to sit across from the library, and how the cinnamon rolls there could ruin a morning in the best way. I told her about the worst job I'd ever taken, an attic full of wasps and insulation so old it disintegrated. At the slightest touch, we laughed. Really laughed. And it surprised us both before I left that night. June did something small that I don't think she realized was significant. She handed me a little tin of cookies she'd baked, lemon shortbread. Still slightly warm, and told me to take them for the road. It was a simple gesture, but something in the way she handed them to me, with a slight hesitation and a hopeful smile, made me feel like I had been given something more than dessert. It felt like trust, like invitation, like maybe this wasn't just about storms anymore. On the drive home, I thought about how strange it was that fear had been the thing to bring us together. Not joy, not convenience, but fear. And yet somehow, in facing it together, we had made space for something softer to grow. Something that looked a lot like comfort, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of healing. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't have a plan or an expectation. But I knew this. If she called again, whether the sky was clear or crashing, I'd show up. Not out of duty, not because I had nothing better to do, but because somehow being there felt like exactly the place I was supposed to be. A few days passed without a call, and I'll admit I was more aware of my phone than usual. I checked it in between jobs, during lunch breaks, even during those short pauses between measuring and drilling when my mind had space to wander. But June didn't call. There was no storm either, so it made sense. Still, it surprised me how much I missed her voice, that calm steadiness underneath the vulnerability, like she was always trying to reassure me while reaching for reassurance herself. Work helped distract me, especially when I took on a garage restoration that turned into a multi-day project. But even as I stood surrounded by paint cans and warped wood, a part of my thoughts remained tethered to that house on the ridge, to June and her candles and soft jazz humming in the background. I wondered what her days looked like when the skies were clear. If she kept the radio on or opened the windows to let in the scent of rain-soaked trees drying under the sun. It wasn't until the end of that week that I saw her again, though this time she didn't call. I ran into her by accident at the hardware store, aisle 6, standing in front of a shelf lined with different sizes of picture hooks and nails. She was wearing a light scarf and a cardigan, her silver streaks more prominent under the store lights. And she didn't notice me at first. She was squinting at the small print on the packaging, like she didn't want to ask for help, but wasn't quite sure what to pick. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When she looked up and saw me, her face lit up in a way that surprised us both. Not dramatic, but unmistakably genuine. She smiled with her eyes first, before the corners of her mouth caught up. And I felt something in my chest shift quietly into place. We exchanged greetings and small talk, standing there between hammers and drywall anchors like two old friends meeting in the least poetic place possible. She told me she was trying to rehang a few old photographs, ones that had come down during the last storm, when a gust of wind pushed open a half-closed window and knocked over a small frame. I offered to come by and help, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her smile softening into something that felt like a silent yes to more than just picture frames. Later that afternoon, I found myself at her house again, walking through that now familiar front door and into a living room that felt subtly different. Maybe it was the sunlight, or maybe it was the way she had opened the curtains wider, but everything seemed brighter. She had laid out the photos on the coffee table, black and white snapshots of younger days. Some clearly decades old, others more recent. There was one of her and her husband standing beside an old canoe at a lake, both wearing windbreakers and smiling like they had just caught the biggest fish in the world. Another showed her as a young woman holding a paintbrush in a cluttered studio, sunlight spilling through the window behind her. As I began measuring and marking the wall, she told me little stories behind each picture. Not long tales, just a few sentences here and there, enough to give the photos weight. She talked about the canoe trips they used to take every autumn, about the studio she once rented above a bakery before life got too full of responsibilities. Her voice didn't carry sadness this time, just nostalgia, like someone flipping through pages of a book they still loved, no longer needed to reread cover to cover. When I finished hanging the last frame, she stepped back and looked at the wall in silence for a moment. Then she said something that caught me off guard, not because it was dramatic, but because of how quiet and sincere it was. She said that seeing the pictures back in place made the house feel less like a memory and more like a home again. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't try. I just nodded and stood with her, looking at those frozen moments on the wall. Feeling like I had been allowed a glimpse into something deeply private, she made tea again, this time chamomile. And we sat by the window watching the last of the golden afternoon light stretch across the floorboards. We didn't talk about storms or fear or grief that day. We talked about tomatoes. She had a small raised garden in the back, mostly herbs, and a few cherry tomato plants that she said never produced much but made her feel connected to something living. I offered to help her reinforce the wooden border around the garden, which was beginning to warp slightly from years of rain. She smiled and said she'd like that. As I packed up my tools, preparing to leave, she walked me to the door and said, "It was nice seeing me outside of a storm." I told her the same. There was a brief pause, the kind that feels like it could either end with a wave goodbye or something more meaningful. Then she reached for the door, but stopped halfway, turning back to ask if I liked peach cobbler. I said I hadn't had a good one in years. She nodded, almost to herself, and said maybe next time I visited she'd bake one. I told her I'd hold her to that. Driving home, I kept thinking about the photographs, not just the images themselves, but the fact that she was ready to put them back up, that she had chosen to reclaim the space that had once been punctuated by loss and time. It made me wonder how many other parts of her life were slowly being rehung, re-anchored, reframed. And I couldn't help but feel like I was being quietly invited to be part of that process, not as a fixer, but as a witness, a companion. That night, as I sat in my apartment flipping through a takeout menu I'd read a dozen times, I realized something else. I hadn't once thought about my own loneliness while I was with her, not in the way I usually did. Not in that heavy, dull ache that creeps in during quiet dinners alone, or when you wake up to an empty place that doesn't ask anything of you. Being with June didn't erase that loneliness, but it softened its edges, made it feel less like an absence and more like a space being gently filled piece by piece with something slower, quieter, and maybe, just maybe, more lasting. I didn't see June again for another week. The days passed in that strange way they do when a person starts to mean more than you initially realized, fast when you're distracted, achingly slow when you sit still too long. I kept myself busy with work, pushing through back-to-back repairs and installations, trying to stay in motion so my thoughts wouldn't drift to that quiet house on the ridge. But they always did. Every time I pulled up to someone else's home, I found myself imagining what June might be doing at that moment. Was she out in the garden pulling weeds, humming to herself? Was she standing by the window, holding a cup of tea while the radio whispered something soft behind her? Was she walking barefoot across the wooden floors, brushing her fingers across the old photographs we'd just rehung? It was strange. I'd known her for such a short time, yet her presence had started to occupy a space in my mind that no one else had filled in years. It wasn't about romance, not exactly. It was something gentler, something rooted in familiarity that had bloomed quickly, but naturally. Like a wildflower growing in a crack of concrete, unexpected, but undeniably real. Still, I didn't want to impose. She hadn't called. She hadn't asked for help or company or anything else. Even though I had told her I'd be there if she needed me, I didn't want to become a shadow on her doorstep every time a cloud passed overhead, so I waited. Then one evening, just as the sun began dipping behind the hills, casting everything in that honey-gold light that only lasts a few minutes, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a storm. There was no rain, no thunder. It's just June's name lighting up the screen. The message was short. "Hey, if you're not busy, I could use a hand with the garden border this week. Let me know what day works." I stared at the message longer than I needed to. There was no urgency in it, no panic, just an invitation. A quiet, simple reach across the distance between us. I felt something warm settle in my chest. Relief, maybe, or something deeper. I replied that I was free tomorrow afternoon and could bring extra lumber if needed. Her response came quickly. "Perfect, I'll make that cobbler." The next day I arrived with wood planks, tools, and a sense of anticipation I tried not to let show. June greeted me at the door, her apron dusted with flour and her smile a little easier than I remembered. She looked comfortable, like she'd been busy but not rushed. Like she'd been waiting in that slow, contented way that comes from knowing someone is coming back. We walked around to the backyard together, where the raised beds sat nestled. Against the fence, the tomatoes had grown taller, small green bulbs beginning to form beneath the leaves. The border was in worse shape than I expected, one side sagging, the corner splitting slightly where the moisture had crept in. I told her we could reinforce it icily, maybe even add a bit more height if she wanted deeper soil. She nodded, said she trusted my judgment. While I worked, she sat nearby on a small folding chair, sipping lemonade and occasionally pointing out things she'd noticed about the plants. It was a quiet rhythmy, measuring and sawing, her commenting on the bees or the angle of the sunlight or the way the rosemary had doubled in size since spring. We didn't fill the air with unnecessary talk, but it didn't feel empty. There was a comfort in the simplicity of the task, in the ease between us. Every now and then, she'd hand me a screw or a bracket without me asking, like she knew what I needed before I did. When the new border was finished, we stood side by side, admiring the work. She reached out and ran her fingers along the fresh wood, then looked at me with that same quiet smile. "I think they'll like it better now," she said, nodding toward the tomatoes. I laughed and agreed. Then she gestured toward the house and said, "Cobbler's ready." Inside, the smell was heavenly warm, sweet, with that slightly caramelized edge that only comes from fruit baked just long enough to blur the line between tart and tender. She served it with a scoop of vanilla ice cream from a tub she pulled from the freezer, and we sat at the kitchen table again, sunlight dappling through the window and casting lazy shadows on the tabletop. We ate in that peaceful silence that comes after a good day's work. When your hands are tired but your spirit feels lighter, after dessert, we lingered at the table, talking about little things, the upcoming harvest festival in town, a local author she liked, the changes in the weather that signaled fall was on its way. At some point, I realized that hours had passed, and the sky outside had shifted to that soft blue-gray of early evening. I stood to leave, but she walked me to the door slowly, like neither of us really wanted to mark the end of the visit. Before I stepped out, she said something that stopped me. "Thank you for coming, not just for today, for showing up." It mattered. There was no dramatic music, no sudden shift in the air. It's just her voice, steady and sincere, and the feeling that something unspoken had been acknowledged. I nodded, told her I'd come by next week to check on the wood after it. Had a few days to settle. She smiled again, that same soft expression I was starting to crave, seeing more than I wanted to admit. Driving home, I kept thinking about how relationships are real ones. The kind that matter don't always announce themselves with grand gestures. Sometimes they grow quietly, through small invitations and repeated presence. Through helping with a garden border and sharing dessert at a worn kitchen table. And I realized I didn't want to go too many days without hearing her voice again. That something had started between us, not fast, not loud, but steady. Like the way rain softens the earth, so new roots can grow. The following week was unusually busy. the kind of stretch where one job bled into the next, leaving little room to think about anything other than measurements, materials, and the steady hum of tools. I worked a long-distance job on the edge of town, repairing a wraparound porch that had nearly collapsed under years of neglect. The couple who owned the place were kind enough, but their endless stream of questions and hovering presence made the days feel longer than they should have. Still, every night when I'd pack up and drive home, dust clinging to my shirt and the ache of effort settling deep into my shoulders, I found myself wondering what June was doing, whether she'd eaten alone again, whether the tomatoes were ripening, whether the scent of peach cobbler still lingered faintly in the corners of her kitchen. I didn't want to seem overeager, but the urge to check in had become its own kind of quiet pressure, pushing at the edges of my thoughts, no matter how much I tried to redirect them. I finally texted her 3 days later. It's just something simple. "Hey, how's the garden holding up?" She responded, not even 5 minutes later, saying it was thriving, that she had more basil than she knew what to do with, and was considering making her late husband's pesto recipe. I offered to bring over pine nuts and parmesan if she'd let me try some. She replied with a smiling emoji and the words, "Tomorrow?" So the next day I finished work early, cleaned up, stopped at the market for a small block of cheese and a little container of pine nuts, and drove the familiar road up to her house. The moment I stepped onto her porch, I felt a strange sense of comfort, like arriving somewhere that didn't need to be impressive to feel like a place you belonged. June opened the door with her usual gentle expression and invited me in. The kitchen smelled fresh and clean, with a faint trace of lemon and rosemary. She wore a pale blue blouse and soft jeans, her silver hair pinned loosely at the back. Hey, she looked like herself, and that felt more reassuring than anything else that day had offered. We spent the next hour prepping the ingredients together. She moved with ease, handing me a small mortar and pestle while she measured out garlic cloves. It wasn't rushed, nor perfectly choreographed, just natural. As we cooked, she told me stories about her husband's obsession with trying to grow garlic in the clay-heavy soil out back, his constant tinkering with fertilizer blends and raised beds. She laughed at the memory, not with sadness, but with genuine fondness, like time had softened the sharpest edges of her grief into something more manageable. When we finally sat down to eat, she poured 2 small glasses of white wine and toasted 2 imperfect recipes in good company. It was the first time I'd seen her drink anything stronger than tea. We ate slowly, the pesto bright and flavorful, in the mood light. After the plates were cleared, we migrated to the back porch, where a few string lights flickered on as the sun slipped behind the trees. Crickets had begun their nighttime rhythm, and the air carried the warmth of late summer, mixed with the subtle hint of cooling earth. We talked about music, her favorite jazz albums, the piano she once owned but had sold years ago. I told her about how I used to play drums as a teenager, though I hadn't touched a set in years. The kind of conversation that opened small windows into who a person was before you met them. Eventually, the conversation slowed into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet. Then she turned toward me slightly and asked if I ever got lonely. Not in a dramatic way, just curiously, softly. Like it was a question she'd asked herself 1,000 times and finally wanted someone else to answer. I thought about it for a moment and told her the truth. Yes, sometimes the silence in my apartment felt heavier than it should. That I'd gotten used to keeping busy so I didn't have to sit with it too long. That being alone wasn't the same as being lonely, but sometimes the two got tangled up. She nodded like she understood without needing more explanation. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. That after her husband died, the quiet had nearly broken her. That she'd gone days without speaking aloud. That she once left the radio on through the night just so the walls wouldn't seem so still. That when she called me during that first storm, it wasn't just because of the weather, it was because the silence had gotten too loud. She couldn't bear it anymore. That she had no idea what made her think of me that night, only that something in her gut said, "Call him." Didn't know what to say at first. My throat tightened. The air felt different, more intimate, as if some invisible thread had been pulled taut between us. She wasn't asking for pity or offering it either. She was sharing something raw, something real. and it made me realize how much trust she had placed in me without ever spelling it out. I reached over, not thinking much about it, and gently touched her hand. She didn't flinch or pull away. She just turned her palm upward and let our fingers rest together. Quietly, we sat like that for a long time, watching the stars emerge one by one. It didn't feel like a beginning or an ending, just a moment suspended in time. And maybe that was the point. Maybe what we were building wasn't meant to follow a script or rush toward a label. Maybe it was just about being present, showing up, and letting the quiet moments be enough. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't walk me to the door this time. She just stood in the soft porch light, watching me as I stepped into the night. And as I turned back for one last wave, I saw something in her eyes that made everything else fade into the background, a kind of peace I hadn't seen before. The kind that comes from not being alone in the dark. The next time I went to June's, it was raining again, though not nearly as dramatic as that first night. A steady drizzle, more soothing than threatening, cast the world in a quiet hush. I had stopped by unannounced this time, but only after she'd told me, in her own understated way, that I didn't need an invitation anymore. She had said it casually. We were watching her cat roll around in a sunbeam on the living room rug. You know, you don't have to wait for a reason to come by. Just show up. I'll probably be here. And that had stuck with me. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a request. It was just a door left ajar, and all I had to do was step through. I brought some wood polish and tools, thinking I could help restore the old bench on her front porch. The finish had chipped in spots, and the wood beneath had begun to gray and crack. It reminded me of the benches my grandfather used to keep out back of his shed. Things that looked rough on the outside but held stories in the grain if you took the time to see them. When I pulled up to her house, her porch light was already on. Even though the daylight hadn't quite faded, she must have seen my truck from the window because the door opened before I even knocked. She greeted me with that now familiar smile and stepped aside to let me in. And I noticed she had 2 mugs of tea already sitting on the counter like she'd expected me. We talked while I worked. The conversation flowing easily, filled with small things, how her lavender was coming in strong this year, how the neighbor's dog had dug under the fence again, how she was thinking of rearranging the living room because the light hit differently this time of year. There was a rhythm between us now, something unspoken but understood. We didn't fill every silence, didn't feel the need to impress or entertain. It felt like we'd fallen into step with one another's pace without ever planning it. One point, while I was sanding down a stubborn, splintered edge of the bench, she disappeared inside for a few minutes and returned holding a photograph. She handed it to me carefully, and I immediately recognized her in the image much younger. Wearing overalls and standing beside a small greenhouse, dirt on her cheeks, and a trowel in one hand, a man stood beside her, arm around her shoulders, equally smudged and smiling like it was the happiest day of his life. She told me it was taken the day they built that greenhouse from scratch, using reclaimed glass panes and lumber from an old barn that had collapsed after a storm. It was their first big project as a couple. She said it had taken them nearly 3 weeks to complete because they kept arguing over the angle of the roof. But in the end, it had become one of their favorite places to spend time together. She still had that trowel, she said, even though the greenhouse had long since come down. I asked her what she missed most, not to press her or stir up pain, but because the question felt honest in that moment. It's like something she was already halfway to answering. She paused, looking out toward the trees where the rain was threading through the leaves. And she said she missed the shared language. It's the way they used to communicate in half-finished sentences, in glances and small gestures, she said, being with someone for so long rewires your thinking. So even when they're gone, you find yourself looking at something and thinking he'd like that, or he'd laugh at this, without even realizing it. That was what she missed, the second voice in her head that used to answer back. It struck me then how much of her was still tethered to the past, not in a way that kept her stuck, but in a way that carried meaning forward. She wasn't trying to escape her memories. She was living beside them. And maybe that's what made being around her feel so different from anyone else I'd known. She wasn't waiting for someone to fix the emptiness. She'd made peace with its presence and simply wanted someone who wouldn't be afraid to sit with it too. As the rain grew heavier, we moved back inside and settled into the living room. She lit a candle on the coffee table, not for scent or light, but for ambience, she said. That was something her husband used to do, light a candle on rainy nights, even if all the lights were on. She said it made the room feel less like a house and more like a moment. I understood what she meant. There was something grounding about the flicker, about the warmth it brought to the space. We talked more that night than usual, and some of it veered deeper than I expected. She asked me about my childhood, about the last person I really let in, about what I wanted for my future. It was strange to be so open, but the honesty came easily around her. I told her about the woman I'd almost married in my 30s, how we'd grown apart not from lack of love, but from incompatible dreams. I told her about my father, who'd passed away without us ever quite patching things up. I told her about the silence that sometimes crept in after I finished a long day of work. The kind of silence that didn't just fill a room but seemed to echo off the walls like a reminder of what was missing. She listened without interruption, her eyes steady and kind. When I finished, she didn't offer solutions or platitudes. She just said, "Thank you for telling me that." And somehow, that was enough. It was more than enough. The rain eventually tapered off into a soft drizzle, and the clock on the mantel chimed 10. I stood to leave, and she walked me to the door, just like she always did. But this time, before I stepped out, she reached out and placed her hand lightly on my arm. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me, and for a brief second, I thought she might ask me to stay. But instead, she said, "I like the way you see things. You notice the quiet parts." And with that, she stepped back, giving me room to go, but not pushing me away. Driving home through the wet streets, I realized something had shifted, not just in our dynamic, but in me. I felt a kind of stillness I hadn't known I was missing. A calm that came not from the absence of noise, but from being understood. And as I parked and sat in the silence of my truck for a few extra minutes, I thought about the bench I'd left half-finished on her porch. About the photo of her covered in dirt and grinning like the world was new, and I knew I'd be back, not because she needed help, but because being near her reminded me of the parts of myself thought had gone quiet for good. The next few visits to June's house came with less and less planning until they didn't feel like visits at all, more like small returns to a place that had somehow become part of my routine. We didn't need an excuse. Sometimes I'd swing by to bring her something from the farmer's market, or she'd call to ask if I could help reach a box in the attic. Other times we wouldn't plan anything, but I'd still end up there. It's both of us acting surprised at how natural it felt that I was helping trim her hedges, or she was stirring something on the stove. While I cleaned out her gutters, there was never a grand plan. It's just a quiet agreement that we were better when we weren't navigating our days alone. One Sunday afternoon, I brought over a few picture frames I'd repaired, antique-looking things she had found in a thrift shop months earlier, which she'd been meaning to use for her collection of old postcards. June had a habit of collecting little fragments of the world, faded postcards from places she'd never visited. Pressed flowers tucked into books, buttons with no shirts to belong to. Wasn't clutter, it was curated memory. When I laid the frames out on the dining table, she studied them with a small smile, running her thumb along the corners. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out a shoebox wrapped in rubber bands. Inside were at least 100 postcards, each one more worn and poetic than the last. Some had messages on the back, written by strangers decades ago. Some were blank. Still waiting for a reason to be sent, she asked if I wanted to help pick which ones to frame, and so we sat together, leaning over the table, holding up card after card to the light, imagining the stories behind them. One was a sunset in Vienna, the back scribbled in German with what looked like a confession of love. Another showed a beach in Maine with a message from a child to her grandmother, dated 1949. We laughed at some of the captions, puzzled over the handwriting in others, and every now and then our fingers brushed as we reached for the same one. There was no awkwardness, just warmth, just closeness. When we finally narrowed it down to 4 and slid them into the frames, she said something I hadn't expected. "It's strange, isn't it? How something meant for someone else can still find meaning with us? Like we've inherited these feelings without even knowing the people who had them. I told her maybe that's what connection really is. Just recognizing something familiar in a place you didn't expect it. She nodded, then quietly added, like I did with you. There was a stillness in the room after that, but not the kind that made you uncomfortable. It was the kind that wrapped around you gently, as if the house itself understood something important had just been said. I didn't rush to respond. Instead, I reached for the frame we'd just completed, the one with the postcard from 1949, and set it upright on her bookshelf. It felt right for it to be seen. She watched me as I did it, and when our eyes met again, hers looked softer somehow, so they'd let go of something heavy. A few days later, a real storm rolled in, not the gentle kind that whispered on rooftops and made candlelight feel romantic. This one came barreling across the hills with low, snarling clouds and wind that bent trees sideways. It was the kind of storm that rattled windows and made even the most well-built houses feel too fragile. I was at home halfway through a late dinner when my phone rang. Her name lit up the screen again, just like it had that first time. My heart rate picked up immediately. When I answered, her voice was calm but tight around the edges, she said. She didn't want to bother me, but the power had gone out and something about the wind made the house feel ... different. She admitted it had. Unsettled her more than she expected. I was already grabbing my jacket before she finished the sentence. I told her I'd be there in 15 minutes. The drive felt longer than it was. Sheets of rain slapped the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. Lightning forked across the sky in sharp, aggressive streaks. But all I could think about was her alone in that big old house, trying not to let fear tip into panic. When I pulled up the drive, her porch light was off, and the whole house sat in darkness. I knocked, called her name, and a few seconds later, the door cracked open. There she was, wrapped in a shawl, flashlight in hand, eyes wide with something. Between relief and apology, I stepped inside, soaking wet, and she immediately reached for a towel, insisting I dry off. I told her I didn't care about the rain, that I was just glad she'd called. She smiled at that, small and grateful. The house was quiet, except for the wind pushing against the walls and the creaks of the old frame responding like bones under. Strena asked if she wanted to sit, and she nodded, leading me to the couch. She lit a candle and placed it on the coffee table, then sat beside me. Close, but not touching. After a moment of silence, she confessed something. That she hadn't been afraid of the storm itself, not really. It was the silence afterward. Darkness. The sense that there was no one else around to anchor her to the present. She said it made her feel like she'd drifted too far from the shore, like if she spoke, no one would hear. That was what scared her most, that she might become invisible in the quiet. So I took her hand, not in a dramatic way, just steady and real. I told her she wasn't invisible, that I saw her, I had from the very beginning, that the silence didn't have to mean emptiness. It could also mean space for something new. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned her head gently against my shoulder and let out a slow breath that sounded like the release of something long held. We stayed like that for a long time. The storm's still growling outside, but inside the house, everything felt still, and I realized in that moment that I hadn't just come over because she'd called. I came because I wanted to be the person she thought to call. Because somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being strangers. Something deeper had taken root. The storm eventually passed, though it left behind that peculiar stillness that always settles over a place after nature has flexed its muscles, and then receded. Trees were dripping. The air felt heavy with moisture and electricity, and puddles had collected in the dips of June's gravel driveway. The power didn't return until late the next morning, but we didn't really notice the absence. That night, after the wind quieted and the house grew calm again, we sat by candlelight, sipping tea she had managed to heat up over a small gas stove she kept for emergencies. It was weak and watery compared to her usual blends, but it felt like the most grounding thing I'd tasted in days. She kept the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. I sat with the blanket she offered draped across my knees. And between us, the silence no longer felt like something to fill it, felt like something to share. We didn't talk much that night. After our quiet exchange on the couch, words became less important. She dozed for a little while with her head resting against my arm, and I let her stay there, not wanting to disturb the rare sense of ease that had settled over her. When she finally woke, she looked at me with eyes still soft from sleep and whispered that it felt like she hadn't rested like that in months. She didn't explain what she meant, but I understood anyway. Sometimes the body rests before the heart catches up. I stayed on the couch that night, not because she asked, but because I couldn't bring myself to leave. Oh. She brought out a spare quilt and placed it gently over me without a word. Before going upstairs, she paused on the landing and looked down at me with a quiet kind of affections, something unspoken but unmistakable. That expression stayed with me long after she disappeared from view. In the days that followed, something shifted between us, but not in any dramatic or sudden way. It was subtle, more about what wasn't said than what was. She started texting me in the mornings with small updates, a photo of the first crocus blooming in her yard, a snapshot of a pie she baked, the corner of a novel she'd rediscovered. I found myself responding more eagerly than I would have admitted. Sending her pictures of funny signs I passed on jobs or brief musings from my drives. Our lives, once separated by routines and individual loneliness, began to thread together in simple, unforced ways. One afternoon, she invited me over to help move some boxes in her attic. The request was practical, but her tone carried a lightness I hadn't heard before. When I arrived, she had already laid out 2 glasses of lemonade on the kitchen counter and was humming something under her breath as she directed me toward the attic ladder. The boxes were dusty and full of memories, photo albums, old linens, her husband's fishing gear, wedding dress preserved in delicate tissue paper. We didn't rush. She sat cross-legged on the floor while I handed things down one by one, and every so often she'd pause and tell me a story tied to what I was holding. There was no sadness in her voice anymore, just warmth and gratitude. At one point I handed her a box of cassette tapes labeled road trip mixes. She laughed and said they used to take long drives with no particular destination, just playing tapes and stopping wherever the wind took them. She admitted that she hadn't been on a real road trip since he died. I offered to take her sometime, half joking, expecting a playful brush-off, but instead, she looked up at me, eyes bright, and said, "I'd like that." That night, as I drove home, I realized I hadn't thought of June as just a widow in a long time. Not any far. She wasn't defined by her loss. Not anymore. Stories, opinions, quirks, and quiet strength. She could be silly and sarcastic, thoughtful and firm. I thought about how easily we'd slipped into each other's lives and how rare it was to find that kind of ease without effort. I'd known love before, complicated, intense, sometimes consuming, but this thing with June, whatever it was becoming, felt different. It felt steady. It's like a kind of emotional gravity pulling us closer without rushing the fall. We took that road trip 2 weeks later, just a short one, 3 days along the coast, staying in small inns and taking our time at every stop. Music from her old playlists, ate at roadside diners, bought souvenirs we didn't need. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses and laughed more than I'd ever seen her laugh. At one beach, she walked barefoot through the surf, pants rolled up, hair blown back by the wind. And for a moment, she looked years younger. She caught me watching and winked. I smiled and looked away, feeling something flutter deep in my chest. One night during the trip, we sat by a fire pit outside our inn, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot cider. The stars were out in full force, and the air smelled like salt and pine. She leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered that she didn't know life could feel this full again. She thought her best years were already behind her. I didn't know what to say, but I reached for her hand and held it tight. That was enough. Later, as we climbed into our separate beds in the shared room, she paused before switching off the light and said, "Thank you for not making me feel like I'm starting over. Just continuing." I lay there in the dark long after the lights went out, thinking about how sometimes healing doesn't come from fixing the broken parts, comes from finding someone willing to sit with you, cracks and all. When we returned, The routine resumed. But it felt different. Lighter. There was a newfound familiarity between us that hadn't existed before. I started spending more nights at her place, fixing things around the house, helping in the garden, reading on the porch while she worked on her puzzles. One morning, I woke up on her couch and found a note on the kitchen table beside a plate of toast and jam. It read, "I'm at the market. Back soon. You know where everything is?" It was the first time she had ever left me alone in her house like that. It struck me as more intimate than any embrace. We never said the words that might have defined what we were becoming. There was no moment of confession, no dramatic kiss in the rain. It was quieter than that. Gentler. We were just two people, choosing, day by day, to stay close. I found peace in that. She did too. Summer slid quietly into early fall, and with it came cooler mornings and slower sunsets. June's house changed with the season. The breezy curtains she once let float freely were now tied back to keep the crisp air at bay. She started baking again, not just because she enjoyed it, but because the warmth of the oven made the kitchen feel like the heart of the home. Every time I walked through her door, I was met with the scent of cinnamon or nutmeg or something equally nostalgic. She made small batches and pretended they were for neighbors or friends, but I knew most of the time they were just for us. It never questioned it. I just brought coffee from my favorite spot, and we'd sit with mismatched mugs and plates of whatever she'd whipped up, sharing mornings that were beginning to feel more like tradition than coincidence. She never asked for anything grand. She didn't need sweeping gestures or declarations. What she appreciated were the small things: the light bulb I replaced and her reading lamp without being asked, the chair leg I tightened when it wobbled, the weeds I pulled from her garden while she watched from the porch. I found satisfaction in those small acts too. Maybe because it gave me something tangible to offer in a world where feelings were too big and messy to wrap in a bow. Maybe because being useful made me feel like I belonged. Whatever it was, I started to realize that every time I helped her, I wasn't just fixing her home, I was building something with her, something neither of us had planned, but both of us quietly nurtured. One Sunday, while organizing her storage room, I stumbled on a box labeled letters. It was shoved behind a few crates, its corners worn soft with age. I wasn't trying to snoop. I was actually looking for a step stool, but when I saw her handwriting on the lid, I paused. I carried it into the hallway and called for her. She was upstairs, folding laundry, and when she came down and saw what I was holding, something unreadable flickered across her face. I asked if she wanted me to put it back, and she hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "We can look through them." We sat on the floor of her living room, legs crossed like kids at camp, the box between us. Inside were bundles of letters tied in string. Some were from her parents, long past. Others from her sister, who lived across the country. Few were from old friends, old coworkers. But the largest bundle, wrapped in soft blue ribbon, was from her husband. Each envelope was dated, most of them from the first decade of their marriage. She untied the ribbon with gentle fingers and picked up the top letter. I thought she'd read it silently, maybe share a line or two, but instead she handed it to me. "Read it out loud," she said. It felt strange, reading someone else's love letter aloud, but she watched me with such quiet trust that I didn't refuse. His handwriting was elegant, the words careful and sincere. He wrote about missing her while on a business trip, about the way her laugh echoed in his mind when he couldn't sleep. He talked about a dream he had where they owned a little house, near a lake, with a dock and a red canoe, and how he hoped someday they'd make it real. When I finished, she smiled and took the letter back. He was always a dreamer, she said, but he had a way of making those dreams feel possible. Spent the afternoon like that, her passing me letters, me reading them aloud. Both of us pausing occasionally to laugh or sigh or grow quiet. It wasn't sad, not in the way I expected. It was tender, reverent, a ceremony of remembrance. When we reached the last one, she looked at the stack and said, "I haven't read these in years." I thought it would hurt too much. But it doesn't. Not with you here. That simple statement struck something deep in me. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. I just reached over, squeezed her hand, and held on. Later that week, I invited her to my place for the first time. It wasn't much, a 2-bedroom. Ranch style with a crooked fence and a kitchen faucet that always dripped, but it was mine. She brought over a pie, and I grilled steaks, and we ate on the back porch while the wind played with the trees. She wandered through my living room afterward, commenting on the books I kept stacked in odd places, the framed photo of my parents, the old guitar leaning against the wall. "You live like someone who doesn't expect visitors," she teased. I laughed and admitted that I hadn't had many until recently. She smiled and said, "Well, that's changing now, isn't it?" That night as I walked her to her car, she paused before getting in. There was something tentative in her posture, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if it was the right moment. I waited. Finally, she said, "I never thought I'd be in someone's home again and feel ... welcome. Not just polite welcome. Real bone-deep welcome." I told her that's how I felt in her house too, that she didn't need to bring pie or call ahead. She just needed to show up. She nodded, eyes glassy but smiling, then said, "We're good at showing up for each other, aren't we?" I nodded back. We were. The relationship, whatever it was, had taken root in something soft and natural. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand labels. It didn't follow timelines or definitions. But it grew day by day. In the pauses, the shared silences, the rituals we didn't even realize we were creating, I started to think about how rare that was. How many people go through life craving connection and yet miss it when it shows up quietly, without fireworks, without fanfare. June and I had found something most people search for with a map and a flashlight. Only weeds stumbled into it. In the middle of a storm, scared and unsure, and now, here we were, sitting in each other's corners like we'd always been meant to, and yet, even in the calm, life has a way of throwing in sharp turns. Just when you think you've found your rhythm, something shifts, something breaks the surface. And though I didn't know it then, a letter would arrive the next week, a letter from someone I'd nearly forgotten, one that would challenge everything we'd built so far and force us both to reckon with what we really wanted, and what we were truly ready for. The letter came in a plain envelope, no return address, no indication of what lay inside beyond my own name written in looping, cursive across the front. I found it tucked in among the usual bills and flyers in my mailbox one Thursday morning. I didn't open it right away. Something about it made me pause. Maybe it was the handwriting, which tugged at the edges of an old memory I hadn't invited in a long time. I set it on the kitchen table, went about making coffee, but my eyes kept drifting back to it, as if it were emitting some silent hum. Eventually, curiosity overruled hesitation. I slid my thumb under the flap, unfolded the paper, and read the first line. "I hope this reaches you before you've forgotten me entirely." My breath caught. It was from Anamai's ex-wife. Her name hit like the snap of cold water. I hadn't heard from her in years, not since our divorce finalized quietly. Without much drama, but with a deep undercurrent of fatigue, neither of us had the energy to fight. We had parted ways with a mutual understanding that we had stopped growing together, that the silence between us had grown too wide to bridge. She moved out of state, and aside from the occasional thought or anniversary date that drifted through my mind uninvited, I had let her go, or so I thought. The letter wasn't long, but it was careful. She wrote about how she'd been thinking of me lately, how seeing an old photo of us on a road trip had stirred something in her. wondered if maybe we gave up too soon. She asked if I ever thought about calling her. She said she wasn't trying to interfere or reopen old wounds, but she wanted to know if there was still space in my life for the version of her that had learned, softened, changed. At the end, she left her number and wrote, "If nothing else, I'd like to hear your voice again, just once." I folded the letter slowly, heart unsettled in my chest. It wasn't guilt I felt, and it wasn't longing either, not exactly. It was more like someone had pulled back the curtain on a room I had closed long ago. And now I was being asked to step inside again, unsure if the air was still breathable. I stared out the kitchen window for a long while, the mug of coffee growing cold in my hands. June's face came to mind, not in contrast to Anna's, but as something separate, grounded, present. Her shawls, her collection of postcards waiting for stories. That evening, I didn't mention the letter to June, not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't yet know what it meant. She had invited me over for soup and a documentary she thought I'd like. We spent the night in the warm flicker of the television's light, bowls in hand, trading thoughts about the film's narration and pausing now and then to talk about completely unrelated things. It was the kind of night that had no urgency. To it, just soft conversation and the comfort of someone knowing when to speak and when not to. But the letter buzzed at the back of my mind like a mosquito I couldn't quite swat. Over the next few days, I debated what to do. I wrote responses and deleted them, dialed the number, only to hang up before the first ring. Her strange, hazy dreams where I couldn't see her face, but heard her voice saying things I couldn't remember when I woke up. Eventually, I did call. I told myself it was for closure, for clarity. Anna picked up on the third ring, her voice, startled, breathy, but unmistakably hers. We spoke for 20 minutes. It was fine. Civil. There were no sparks, no emotional breakdowns. Just two people talking across a long stretch of time. She sounded good, calmer. She told me about her new job, a dog she'd adopted, a house with a porch she loved sitting on. She asked about me, and I was honest, mostly. Said I was doing well, that I'd met someone I cared about deeply, that I wasn't looking back, not really. She said she was glad to hear that. And then we said goodbye. When I told June a few days later, we were sitting in her backyard, the first yellow leaves falling lazily from the trees above us. I didn't dramatize it. Just told her the facts, gently, clearly, leaving space for whatever reaction she needed to have. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "And how did it feel?" I answered truthfully, like looking at an old house I once lived in. Familiar, but not home. She smiled at that. A real smile. Not one stretched thin by discomfort. She reached for my hand and said, "I'm glad you looked. It means you're sure." And I was. That letter, instead of pulling me backward, had become a mirror. It showed me what I'd outgrown, what I'd survived, and what I now had in front of me. With June, things weren't perfect. We had our moments of misalignment, of quiet differences, but what we had was real. It was growing, and it wasn't built on nostalgia or the aching to rewrite the past. It was rooted in the present, in soft mornings, shared routines, and the knowledge that neither of us needed saving, just needed each other. That fall, I started leaving a spare toothbrush at her place, a jacket on the hook, books on her nightstand. She didn't say anything about it, but she didn't move them either. They stayed like quiet symbols of something taking shape without needing to be named. She began doing the same, leaving her favorite blanket draped over my couch, storing her special tea in my kitchen, humming her way through my laundry room. Our lives weren't blending. They were learning how to coexist gently, like rivers, running beside each other, close enough to touch but not needing to merge entirely. We still hadn't used the word relationship. We hadn't had a conversation about where it was going or what it meant, but we didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already being said in how we showed up, how we listened, how we stayed. The first time she called me home, it was by accident, or maybe it wasn't. We had just returned from a farmer's market, both of us laughing as we carried brown paper bags brimming with fresh herbs, warm bread, and a pie she hadn't intended to buy but couldn't resist. She was rummaging through her purse for her keys, struggling a bit with her scarf and the handle of the pie box slipping down her wrist. When she exhaled a little breathless laugh and said, "Let's just get inside. It's chilly, I want to. Get this tea steeping and put the bread away before the house feels like home again." Then she paused, catching her words. I looked at her. She looked at me. A quiet passed between us, but neither of us corrected it. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and I followed. The word lingered like a note sustained too long in the air, warm and humming. I didn't bring it up, not that day, not the next. But it stayed with me the way she said it, not like a declaration, but like a simple truth she hadn't even realized she believed until it slipped out. And to be honest, I felt it too, more than I wanted to admit. Her home had become a kind of sanctuary. My tools lived in the garage now. My mug was always in the dishwasher. Her cat, which initially only tolerated my presence, had begun curling at my feet when we read on the couch. There was no line anymore between visiting and staying. I was just there, and the remarkable thing was how unremarkable it felt, like it had always been this way. One evening, she asked me to help clean out the last of her husband's belongings. It wasn't framed as a major event. She didn't dress it in meaning or ceremony. She simply said she was ready to make space and would like someone there with her while she did it. I understood. We climbed to the attic together, each carrying boxes down to the guest room, which we laid out like a temporary museum. She opened each one carefully, methodically, holding up sweaters that still smelled faintly of cologne, tools with his initials carved into the wood, photo frames with yellowing tape clinging to the corners. She didn't cry. Instead, she told stories about the day he bought that old leather jacket even though it was too big, about how he used to hum when fixing things around the house, about the time he tried to cook her a surprise dinner and nearly burned the kitchen down. I listened. Not as a replacement, but as a witness. Her memories weren't ghosts, they were bricks in the foundation of the woman I'd grown to care about. When we reached the last box, she pulled out a small velvet pouch and opened it to reveal a ring, simple, gold worn thin at the edges, her wedding band. She held it for a long moment, then placed it on the nightstand and turned to me. "I want to keep this," she said. "Not to wear, just because it was part of me for so long. But I'm ready to put the rest away." I nodded. We boxed everything up again, this time more neatly, more intentionally, and carried them down to the basement where she planned to store them. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about making room for something new. That night, as we sat on the porch under a quilt, sipping spiced cider, I finally told her that I remembered when she called me home, smiled, a little embarrassed, but didn't deny it. Instead, she said, "I didn't mean to say it out loud, but I did mean it." I reached for her hand and said, "Me too." We didn't say much else. The quiet was enough, had always been enough. A week later, we hosted our first dinner together. It wasn't a big gathering, just her sister, who was visiting from out of town, and an old friend of mine from the workshop. We cooked side by side, laughing over spilled spices and the accidental burning of garlic bread. The night went smoothly, full of stories and old songs playing through the speakers. At one point, I saw her watching me from across the table, her eyes soft, reflective. Later, after the guests had left and the dishes were soaking, she rapped her arms around me from behind as I dried the counter. "Thank you for not rushing me," she whispered. I turned and kissed her temple. "We have time," I said, "but time is a strange thing. It stretches when you want to savor it and slips when you finally feel settled." Just when the days felt like they were following a gentle rhythm, the phone call came that shifted it all. Again, her daughter Millie was coming to stay. She had just gone through a painful breakup, was taking leave from work, and needed a place to heal. June had offered her the guest room, of course, and I could tell by the tone in her voice that she was anxious. Not about her daughter's visit, but about how it would change what we had. She told me over dinner, fidgeting with her napkin, clearly worried. I assured her it was okay, that I understood, that family came first. But there was a question floating just under the surface, one neither of us quite voiced. What would change with another person in the house? Would we retreat? Would we pretend? Would we still hold hands in the kitchen or share quiet mornings in our robes? She didn't ask, and I didn't answer. But I promised myself that whatever happened, I wouldn't disappear. I had found something real with her, and even if we had to pause or pivot or redefine, I wasn't letting go. Not now. Not after everything. Emily arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon. The sky spitting light drizzle, the kind that didn't quite soak you but made everything feel damp and slow. June had spent the whole morning cleaning. Not that the house was ever messy, but she dusted the picture frames twice, fluffed every pillow in the living room, reorganized the guest room drawers, even though Emily was only bringing 2 suitcases. I could see the nervous energy in her hands, the way she hovered by the kitchen window when she knew it was still too early for Emily to arrive. I stayed close, quietly fixing the sagging shelf in the laundry room, refilling the hummingbird feeder, giving her space while making sure she didn't feel alone in her anticipation. When the silver sedan finally pulled into the driveway, June's breath caught like a wire being pulled tight. She opened the door before Emily even rang the bell. The moment they embraced, I stepped into the kitchen and busied myself with boiling water for tea, giving them the moment they clearly needed. Emily looked a little older than the photos June kept on the mantel, more tired, eyes ringed with the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from emotional unraveling. She was polite when June introduced us, her handshake firm but distant, her smile tight around the edges. I didn't take it personally. I could tell she was in a vulnerable place, and I didn't want to intrude. Over the next few days, she mostly stayed in her room or took long walks alone, earbuds tucked in, and her hood drawn up even when the sky was clear. June tried gently to pull her into conversation, into meals, into shared TV time on the couch, but Emily kept one foot emotionally outside, like she hadn't decided yet whether this was just a stopover or a safe place to land. I noticed the shift between June and me almost immediately. She didn't touch my arm when we passed in the hallway. She didn't reach for my hand at breakfast. She didn't kiss me on the cheek when I brought in firewood or fixed the porch light. It wasn't that she was cold, just reserved, careful, and I understood. She and Emily were close, but they hadn't talked in depth about us. Me that once, weeks ago, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that she didn't know how to explain this new chapter of her life to her daughter. Didn't want to complicate things or seem like she was rushing into something at her age. That I wasn't here to make demands. I just wanted to be present in whatever way she needed. One evening, I stayed later than usual. June had made her vegetable stew, the one with thick hunks of potato and just enough spice to leave a lingering warmth on your tongue. We ate in the kitchen while Emily took a call in the living room, pacing back and forth in front of the windows with her arms crossed. June was quieter than usual, stirring her stew slowly between bites, and I could tell her mind was elsewhere. When Emily finally ended the call and excused herself for the night, June reached across the table and touched my wrist gently. "Thank you for being patient," she said. I nodded. "This is her space too," I replied. "I get it." Smiled faintly, and we didn't say anything more about it. Over the next week, Emily slowly began to emerge from her shell. Not dramatically, but in small, hesitant ways. She joined us for coffee in the mornings, curled on the armchair while June and I shared the love seat. She started asking me about my work, what kinds of things I built, if I liked it, how long I'd been doing it. Her questions were cautious, almost academic, but I welcomed them. Answered plainly, offered anecdotes when she seemed curious, and let the conversation drop when she needed space. Eventually, she started baking in the afternoons, filling the kitchen with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. And one evening, she brought out a batch of shortbread and said, "Thought you two might want to try these." It was a peace offering. We both accepted gratefully. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, June and I sat by the fire. She looked more relaxed, her shoulders not quite so high, her brow not quite so furrowed. "She's trying," she said softly. She doesn't say much, but I can see it. She wants to understand. I nodded, letting the firelight flicker across my hands. "We'll give her time," I said. "There's no rush." June leaned her head against my shoulder. "You've been so good through all this," she whispered. I don't know how I got so lucky. I turned slightly, just enough to press a kiss to the crown of her head. You weren't lucky, I said. We're brave enough to call me that night, and everything since then. That was choice, not luck. The next day, Emily found me on the back porch repairing a broken screen. She sat on the steps, pulling her sweater tight around her, and asked if she could talk. I put my tools down and gave her my attention. She looked nervous, uncertain, but there was resolve in her voice when she finally said, I was angry at. First, not because of you, just angry that she moved on, that she found someone. But then I started watching the way you treat her, and it's not like you're replacing anyone, you're just here, and I think that's what she needed. I stayed quiet, letting her say what she needed to say. After a moment, she added, I'm glad she called you that night. I don't know who she would have become if she hadn't. I smiled, quietly grateful. She saved me too, I said. That call, it changed both of us. By the time Emily left to return home, something had shifted, not just in her, but in June and me as well. We were no longer tentative. We didn't pull back in front of others. When we hugged goodbye at the door, it was with the ease of something real, something known. As Emily hugged her mom and promised to call more often, she turned to me and said, Take care of her, okay? Promised I would. And when the car pulled away and the dust settled in the driveway, June reached for my hand again. Not cautiously this time, but with certainty, like we had passed a quiet test neither of us knew we were taking. After Emily's departure, the house took on a quieter rhythm again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was softer now, lived in, familiar. June moved through her days with a sense of ease I hadn't seen in a long time, like some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She began humming again while making tea, something she hadn't done while Emily was there, and she lingered in the mornings in her robe. Curling beside me on the couch without apology, we resumed our slow dance of daily rituals the Sunday. Morning market trips, the crossword puzzles after lunch, the long walks through the woods just behind her property. It felt for the first time like we were building something that could last. One morning in mid-October, while we were raking leaves into a giant amber pile at the edge of her lawn, June turned to me and asked if I ever thought about what it meant to grow old with someone. She said it without preamble, just tossed it out there with the same tone she used when asking about lunch or what time the post office closed. I paused, resting on the rake handle, and considered it carefully. I told her I'd always thought growing old with someone meant having a person to share the mundane with, the grocery lists, the leaky faucets, the quiet dinners, but that I'd come to realize it was also about having someone who knew your story, not just your habits. Someone who understood the reasons behind your silences, your soft spots, your instincts. She nodded slowly, like that had confirmed something for her she already suspected. And then she smiled. It's not the polite kind, but the full one, the one. That made the corners of her eyes crinkle and her shoulders drop. That afternoon, I found her in the garage, rummaging through a dusty box labeled Old Things. She pulled out a set of paintbrushes, still stained with color, and a stack of half-finished canvases she hadn't touched in years. She told me she used to paint in her 30s, mostly landscapes and birds, but stopped sometime after Emily was born. Life got too busy. The creative space, she said, had gotten pushed aside by diapers and dinner and bills. I encouraged her to try again. The next day, we cleared out a small corner in the sunroom for her to set up an easel and supplies. She started with simple strokes, hesitant at first, but as the days passed, I watched her rediscover a rhythm in it. Her hands knew what to do, even if her confidence had dulled over time. I think the painting gave her something private, again a piece of herself. She didn't have to share unless she wanted to. And yet, one morning, she invited me into the sunroom while she worked. Well, she didn't say much, just handed me a cup of coffee and motioned to the chair across from her. We sat there in comfortable silence, the soft sound of bristles sweeping over canvas filling the air. It was an intimacy of a different kind, one I hadn't known I needed. She was beautiful like that, in her element, unguarded, focused. Weeks passed. And then one evening in early November, June received another phone call that changed the energy in the room. This time, It was her sister. Their mother, who had been in a long-term care facility for some time now, had taken a turn. Nothing immediate, they said, but it was enough to stir worry. June hung up and sat very still, her thumb tracing a line along the hem of her sweater. She didn't cry. She didn't speak right away. But I could feel the worry blooming in her chest. I took her hand and we sat together in the growing dusk until the tension softened, just enough for her to lean against me. The next morning, we packed a bag and made the drive out to her mother's facility 2 hours away. The roads wound through patches of farmland and small towns with forgotten gas stations and roadside diners. June barely spoke, and I didn't press her. When we arrived, her sister was already there, and the two women embraced with the kind. A familiarity that only comes from decades of shared joys and resentments. I stepped back, gave them space, and waited in the hallway while they visited. Later, June asked if I wanted to come in and meet her mother. I was surprised, but I said, yes. The room was warm, filled with the scent of lavender and old books. Her mother was frail, her eyes clouded with age, but sharp when they landed on June. They exchanged quiet words. And then June introduced me simply as someone very important to me. Her mother smiled, extended her hand, and said it was nice to meet me. Her grip was soft, but purposeful. I sat for a while as they talked about old neighbors and recipes and a shared memory of a summer vacation long ago. When we left, June squeezed my hand tightly the entire walk back to the car. That night in the hotel room, she finally cried. Not the heavy sobs of despair, but the soft release of someone holding too much for too long. I held her until she slept, her breath slowing against my chest, and I felt something inside me settle more firmly than ever before. This wasn't just companionship. This wasn't convenience. This was a choice every day, a commitment not made in vows, but in presence. When we returned home, something had shifted again, but in a good way. There was less hesitation in her touch, more warmth in her eyes. She began referring to us with words like we and ours. She added a drawer for me in her dresser, and I started leaving books on her nightstand without needing to ask. The change was quiet but unmistakable. We were no longer navigating the possibility of something. We were in it, fully, gently, real by. The time the first real snow began to fall, blanketing the world outside her windows in a hushed, glistening stillness. Our routines had become not just habits, but lifelines. The cold seemed to draw us even closer. Mornings became slower, steeped in quiet rituals, her cinnamon oatmeal simmering on the stove. My hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, both of us watching the trees shed their last reluctant leaves. We didn't speak much during those early hours. We didn't need to. The silence was rich with understanding. And it was in those silences that I realized we had grown beyond whatever vague category of companionship we had initially entered. What we had was deeper than dating, less performative than love stories usually are. It was a bond shaped by storms literal and emotional that neither of us had seen coming. And yet here we were, warm and steady in the middle of winter. One morning, as I was patching up a cracked window pane in the garage, June came out with a plate of warm apple scones and told me she'd been thinking about taking a short trip together. Something quiet, something new. Just a few days. It's maybe a little cottage by a lake or a sleepy mountain town with a bookstore and a fire pit. The suggestion surprised me. June wasn't spontaneous by nature. She liked schedules and weather forecasts and packing lists, but something had shifted in her recently, not recklessness, but a kind of soft urgency. Like she'd come to understand the value of doing things now, instead of waiting for someday. One agreed immediately, not because I needed a vacation, but because I knew how important it was for her to choose joy while she could. We settled on a small lakeside cabin about 3 hours north. The drive was quiet and beautiful, the trees heavy with frost, the sky a soft wintry blue. When we arrived, the cabin was even cozier than the pictures had shown. Stone fireplace, heavy plaid blankets, and a kitchen stocked with mismatched mugs and jars of herbal tea. We spent the first evening just sitting by the fire watching the flames shift and curl. Her legs draped over mine as she read aloud from an old mystery novel she found on the cabin shelf. It was peaceful in a way that felt real, no phones buzzing. No clocks ticking loudly, no obligations clawing at our backs. Just two people who had somehow, despite everything, found each other. On the second night, as snow began to fall outside in thick, dreamy flakes, she asked if I ever thought about what would have happened if she hadn't called me that stormy night. It was the first time she'd brought it up in months. I told her I thought about it all the time. I remembered the exact sound of her voice on the phone, shaky but firm, a strange mix of fear and strength, that I'd never forget the way the house looked when I pulled into her driveway. The way the rain had hit the windshield, the way she had opened the door with her cardigan, pulled tight, and how something had clicked inside me even before she spoke. She smiled quietly, then whispered that she'd almost talked herself out of calling, that she had stared at her phone for 10 minutes, thumb hovering, before pressing the button. I told her I was glad she hadn't waited any longer. We stayed in that cabin for 3 nights, and on the final morning, June stood at the window and watched the sun break through a low band of clouds over the lake. Her breath fogged the glass, and when she turned to me, her eyes looked brighter than I'd seen in weeks. I used to think stories like this only happened to younger people, she said. Like life after 50 was just coasting. But I feel more alive now than I did at 30. I walked over and kissed her gently, forehead to forehead. That's because you chose to live it, not just wait through it, I said. She rested her hands on my chest and nodded, and you chose to show up. When we returned home, it was as if the house had been waiting for us. It smelled like itself, again her lotions and teas, and the faintest hint of cedar from the firewood we kept stacked beside the hearth. But more than that, it felt like we'd carved out a new space between us, something more permanent, more rooted. She began referring to that trip with phrases like our place and next time. She talked about hanging a few of her new paintings in the hallway, and she let me build her a new spice rack for the kitchen, even though she didn't really need one. She gave me a key to the house, not with any announcement, just quietly placed it on the hallway table and said, "For when I forget where mine is." But I knew what it meant. That winter stretched on with unusual warmth, not in temperature, but in texture. We baked more, had movie nights with popcorn and mismatched blankets. She painted while I repaired old furniture in the garage. I stayed over most nights, and she stopped referring to the spare bedroom as yours and started calling it the room for guests. Every change was subtle, but each one built on the last like bricks in a wall that wasn't meant to divide, but to protect what we were building. One evening in late January, I brought her a small ring box knot for a proposal, but with a keychain inside shaped like a small house. She laughed when she opened it, tears forming in her eyes. "It's not an engagement ring," I said. "Maybe it's a kind of promise. That I'm not going anywhere, that this is real." She nodded, holding it like it was something delicate, and then kissed me in the kind of slow, quiet way that made everything else fall away. Winter deepened. The house seemed to pulse with the warmth of the small world June and I had carved out together. Outside, the snow thickened, frosting the landscape in white quiet, but inside, life moved in rhythms both comforting and new. Each morning, the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the quiet hum of the heater, and June would read the paper aloud, her voice steady and sure. I found myself watching her in those moments, the way the light caught the soft silver in her hair, the way her eyes lit up at the crossword clues she always found frustrating but never gave up on. I could tell she was settling into a space. I'd hoped she'd find not just the physical comfort of a roof over her head, but the emotional peace of knowing she wasn't alone anymore. Our conversations grew longer, richer, delving into memories and dreams alike. One afternoon, while shoveling the driveway together after a heavy snowfall, June told me stories from her childhood, how she and her siblings would sneak outside in the dead of night during winter storms to catch snowflakes on their tongues, how their mother would bake pies to warm the house. She spoke softly, but with a spark in her eyes that made those memories feel alive again. I shared some stories, too, the kind of things a man remembers from youth, the first tools he learned to use the times he felt like he didn't quite fit in. We laughed over our differences and marveled at the unexpected ways our paths had crossed. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the windows rattled in their frames, June reached for my hand in the dark. We sat by the fire, the flicker of flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, and she told me she'd been thinking about the future not in the way that scares people, but in the hopeful way that says maybe there is more ahead. She admitted that after years of facing loss and uncertainty, it was strange to imagine days filled with simple happiness. But with me, those thoughts no longer felt impossible. The idea of waking up next to someone who cared, who understood, was becoming a kind of quiet promise. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was a calm that seemed to grow stronger with every shared glance and touch. It wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic moments. It was about showing up, again and again, in the small ways that build trust, the morning coffee waiting on the kitchen table, the blanket draped over tired shoulders, the soft goodnight kisses that lingered a little longer. Our love wasn't flashy or loud. It was steady and patient, the kind that gathers strength from hardship and grows resilient. As winter turned to early spring, the days slowly lengthened, and the snow melted into muddy puddles and budding branches. We began spending more time outdoors, tending to the garden that June had neglected the previous year. I built new raised beds while she planned the flowers and herbs she wanted to plant. Together, we pruned the old rose bushes and cleared the beds of dead leaves. It felt like starting over in so many ways, not just with the garden but with life itself. The earth beneath our feet was soft and rich, promising growth and renewal. Our partnership felt the same, rooted in soil that was both familiar and fresh. One afternoon, while planting daffodil bulbs, June paused and looked at me with a smile that caught me off guard. She said she never thought she'd find someone to share these moments with again, especially at this stage in her life. She told me she had given up on love, convinced that it was a chapter closed long ago. But I was proof that sometimes life has unexpected gifts waiting just around the corner when you least expect them. I told her I felt the same way, that meeting her had reshaped my own ideas of what it meant to love and be loved. Our days were no longer measured just by tasks or routine, but by the quiet joy of companionship, the shared jokes over dinner, the comfort of knowing there was someone who truly cared. I saw her confidence grow, the way she stood a little taller, smiled a little more freely, and allowed herself to hope again. There was still uncertainty, of course. Life had a way of reminding us that nothing was guaranteed. But we faced those unknowns together, hand in hand, ready to meet whatever came next. As spring fully bloomed, bringing color and life back to the world, June and I began to make plans for the summer. We talked about visiting new places, meeting new people, and maybe even hosting friends for dinner parties. She laughed at the idea of hosting, saying she'd always been more comfortable as a guest than a hostess. But I could see in her eyes that she wanted to open her home and heart wider than before. I promised to be her partner in all of it, the dinners, the travels, the everyday moments that make life rich. The storm that had brought us together was long behind us, but its memory lingered like a quiet testament to the strength we'd found in each other. It had taken fear and uncertainty to push us into the open, to break down walls and let in light. Now, as I sat beside her on the porch swing one warm evening, watching the sun set behind the trees, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for her call, for her trust, for the chance to build something real in the middle of life's chaos. It was a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the deepest connections, and that love, no matter when it arrives, is always worth embracing. Summer arrived slowly but surely, like a gentle promise fulfilled after a long winter of waiting. The garden bloomed in vibrant bursts of color, tulips, daisies, and her beloved lavender stretching toward the sun. June and I spent countless hours outside tending to each plant as if it were a metaphor for the new life we were nurturing together. The air was thick with the scent of earth and blossoms, and our laughter echoed between the trees in ways that felt both familiar and new. Each day brought a quiet joy, an intimacy shaped by shared moments rather than grand gestures. Was in these simple acts, watering the roses, fixing the fence post that had leaned too far, cooking dinner side by side that the true depth of our connection grew. One afternoon, June suggested a picnic by the nearby river, a spot she used to visit. As a child, we packed a basket with sandwiches, fresh fruit, and homemade lemonade and set off in our old truck, the windows down, the warm breeze carrying the hum of cicadas. The river was exactly as she remembered, clear and cool, surrounded by towering oaks and wildflowers. We found a shaded spot beneath a willow tree and settled in, the water's gentle rush providing a soothing soundtrack. As we ate, we talked about everything and nothing: the past, the future, our hopes and fears. That revealed the layers beneath the surface, the quiet truths we often keep to ourselves. I told her how much I admired her courage. Our call during that stormy night had changed my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. She smiled, the sunlight catching the silver strands in her hair, and said she was grateful I'd answered that night back at her house. The crickets sang outside as we sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a shared blanket. June pulled out an old photo album she'd found in the attic, and together we flipped through the yellowed pages. There were pictures of her as a young woman, her smile bright and unguarded, the family gatherings, holidays, and candid moments frozen in time. I listened as she recounted stories behind each photo, the bittersweet mix of nostalgia and acceptance clear in her voice. It struck me how much history she carried with her, how every wrinkle and scar was a testament to a life fully lived. Yet here we were, creating new memories that felt just as precious. As the weeks passed, our bond deepened, but so did the reality of the challenges life still held. June's health, while stable, required careful attention. She had routine doctor's appointments, some tests, and moments of fatigue that reminded us both of the fragility beneath her strength. I was there for every visit, every phone call, every anxious pause. It was a role I embraced without hesitation because it wasn't just about helping it was about standing beside her, silent promise that she wasn't alone. We talked openly about these moments, never shying away from the fear or uncertainty. Instead, we faced them head-on, drawing strength from each other. One rainy evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, June confessed she still sometimes felt afraid of losing her independence, afraid of the unknown. She told me about nights when sleep wouldn't come, and her mind spun with what-ifs. I held her close and reminded her that fear was a part of being human, but it didn't have to define her, that she was stronger than she realized, and that I would be there every step of the way. We spoke about hope not as a naive wish, but as a deliberate choice to believe in better days despite the shadows. It was in that moment that I realized how deeply we had come to trust one another, how much we had woven ourselves into the fabric of each other's lives. Our days became a balance of light and shadow, of picnics and doctor visits, laughter, and quiet talks. We learned to celebrate the small victories, like a good test result or a day when fatigue didn't win. And we learned to lean on each other during the harder moments, finding comfort in shared strength. June started writing. Again, something she hadn't done since she was young. She filled notebooks with reflections, poems, and short stories. Sometimes she read them aloud to me in the evenings by candlelight. Her words were raw and honest, capturing the complexity of life's twists and turns. I admired her bravery in putting those feelings into the world, and I felt honored to witness her journey. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the fields, June and I stood hand in hand, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. She turned to me and whispered, "Thank you for rushing over that night, for not hesitating." I smiled and squeezed her hand, telling her it was the best decision I ever made. The storm that had once terrified her had ultimately brought us together to people who found hope and healing in the midst of uncertainty. And as the evening settled around us, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it side by side, ready to embrace the next chapter with courage and love. The rhythm of our life together settled into a comforting cadence, a quiet melody, underscored by the everyday, the kind of moments that, when strung together, create something lasting and profound. As spring melted into summer, June and I found ourselves exploring the edges of what it meant to build a life anew. We took long walks through the neighborhood, discovering hidden paths and secret gardens, places that felt untouched by time. Sometimes we paused to watch children playing in yards or neighbors tending to their own gardens, the simple scenes weaving into the tapestry of our days. In those moments, the world seemed full of possibility, and I felt deeply grateful to be a part of June's journey. We continued to share our stories, peeling back layers of the past that shaped us. June spoke candidly about the years of loneliness that followed her divorce, the nights spent questioning if she would ever find companionship again. She described the small victories, learning to enjoy her own company, embracing solitude without fear, and the hard lessons about trusting others. I shared my own struggles, the mistakes I'd made, the hopes I'd once buried beneath cynicism. There was no need to hide behind facades. Honesty was the foundation on which we were building. It was healing to be seen in our entirety, flaws and all. One afternoon, as we sat beneath a sprawling oak tree in the park, June asked if I ever regretted coming when she called during that storm. I thought about it and told her the truth. Not once. That night had been the turning point. A moment when fate took a sharp turn and led us to something neither of us expected but both desperately needed. She smiled softly and said she felt the same way. It was as if the storm had been both a warning and a blessing, a catalyst for change that neither of us could ignore. As summer deepened, we began to invite a few friends over, carefully at first, then with more confidence. June was hesitant at first, unsure if she was ready to re-enter social circles after so long, but I reassured her that we would take it at her pace. Our gatherings were simple barbecues in the backyard, potluck dinners, evenings spent around a fire pit sharing stories and laughter, or watching her open up to others. Seeing the joy it brought her was a gift in itself. It reminded me that connection wasn't limited to just the two of us, but extended outward in waves. Despite the joy, we were not immune to setbacks. June faced moments of exhaustion and frustration, days when the weight of her fears pressed heavily against her chest. On those days, I learned to recognize the signs, the quiet withdrawal, the sighs heavier than usual. I became her steady presence, offering support without pressure, reminding her that vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. Sometimes we sat in silence, sometimes we talked late into the night, unraveling worries until they felt less daunting. Those moments deepened our bond in ways words couldn't fully capture. One evening, as twilight draped the sky in soft purples and blues, June shared a memory from her youth, of a time she had felt completely fearless, running barefoot through a field of wildflowers with abandon. She spoke of how life's challenges had dulled that fearless spirit, but how being with me, she felt sparks of it reigniting. I told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. She nodded, a spark of that old fire returning to her eyes. The coming of fall brought a new chapter. We talked about traveling, about seeing places neither of us had been before. There was talk of quiet weekends in coastal towns, visits to art galleries, and drives through mountain roads painted with autumn's fiery hues. These plans weren't about grand adventures, but about savoring moments, discovering joy in the unexpected. They symbolized hope not just for the immediate future, but for the years to come. As the leaves turned and fell, we found comfort in the changing seasons, embracing the inevitability of time with open hearts. The storm that had brought us together was no longer just a memory, but a foundation, a reminder of resilience, trust, and the unexpected beauty of new beginnings. And as I looked at June, sitting beside me with a serene smile, I knew that sometimes the most terrifying moments lead to the most profound connections, teaching us that love and hope can bloom at any age. As autumn gave way to the early whispers of winter, June and I found ourselves embracing a rhythm that was both new and comforting, harmony crafted from shared vulnerability and quiet strength. The days grew shorter and the air cooler, but inside the walls of her home, a gentle warmth persisted, a testament to the bond we had forged. Our conversations deepened in intimacy, peeling back layers of fear, hope, and memories that had long been tucked away. It was in these moments that I saw not just the woman who had reached out during a storm, but the fierce spirit that had weathered countless trials before that night. She spoke openly about the loneliness that had shadowed her years, the griefs she carried quietly, and the fragile hope that had flickered back to life since our paths crossed. We shared stories from our pasts, her tales of youthful dreams and hard-earned wisdom, my own reflections on life's unpredictable turns. Sometimes our talks drifted into the philosophical, exploring what it meant to start over later in life, to find connection when society often whispers that it's too late. We challenged those notions together, proving through our own experience that love and companionship don't come with an expiration date. There was a quiet rebellion in our bond, a refusal to be defined by age or circumstance. Instead, we embraced the possibilities ahead, crafting a future built on mutual respect and shared joy. Winter settled in fully, blanketing the neighborhood in snow and stillness. The harshness of the season outside contrasted with the softness we nurtured inside, spent long evenings by the fire, wrapped in blankets, in each other's company, reading books, listening to music, or simply being present. The quiet was no longer lonely. It was filled with the unspoken comfort of knowing someone was there, a constant amidst life's uncertainties. June's laughter returned in full, bright and unrestrained, a sound that warmed the coldest nights. Watching her rediscover joy was one of the greatest gifts I'd ever received. Yet, life continued to test us. Health concerns occasionally cast shadows, reminders of the fragility we both acknowledged but refused to let define us. We faced these challenges together, approaching each hurdle with honesty and determination. I became her advocate, her steadfast supporter during doctor visits and moments of doubt. In turn, she showed me the power of resilience and grace, teaching me to appreciate the present even amid difficulty. Our relationship grew not in spite of these obstacles, but because of them, deepening into something unshakable. As the holiday season approached, we decided to invite a few close friends over to celebrate a small gathering filled with warmth, laughter, and shared stories. June, once hesitant about opening her home and heart to others, found joy in hosting, her confidence blossoming alongside the festive decorations. We cooked together, creating meals that spoke of comfort and tradition and shared moments that felt like family. It was a celebration not just of the season, but of the journey we had undertaken together. The storm survived, the fears faced, and the love found in the aftermath. In those days, I often found myself reflecting on how a single phone call in the middle of a terrifying storm had altered the course of both our lives. That night had been a catalyst, a turning point that led to unexpected companionship and healing. It reminded me that sometimes reaching out in moments of fear can open doors to connection and hope. June's bravery in making that call, despite her terror, was a testament to the strength we all carry within us, waiting to be called forth. As the year drew to a close, we looked toward the future with cautious optimism, understanding that life would continue to bring both joys and challenges. But now, instead of facing them alone, we had each other, a partnership built on trust, compassion, and shared history. The storm that once symbolized fear had transformed into a metaphor for resilience and new beginnings. Proving that it's never too late to find light in the darkest of nights, the turning of the calendar to a new year brought with it a sense of quiet celebration between June and me, a moment to acknowledge how far we had come and the uncharted path still ahead. It was not a journey marked by grand milestones or dramatic upheavals, but rather a steady unfolding of trust, companionship, and unexpected love. The storm that had once rattled her house and sent a call of fear into the night now felt like a distant memory, a starting point rather than an end. We had weathered more than just that tempest. We had faced uncertainty, loneliness, and vulnerability together, emerging stronger and more connected than ever. Our days settled into a comforting routine, a dance of shared rituals and spontaneous moments. Mornings began with coffee brewed just the way June liked it, and evenings ended on the porch with the sky painted in hues of pink and gold. We talked about dreams, both small and large, plans for a garden in the coming spring, visits to places neither of us had seen, and the simple pleasure of growing old together in a world that sometimes seemed too fast and unforgiving. In those conversations, there was a profound sense of gratitude, not just for each other, but for the chance to redefine what love meant in this chapter of life. Though we both carried the scars of past losses and disappointments, we chose to focus on what was possible now. Our relationship was not about erasing the past, but embracing it, using it as a foundation to build something genuine and enduring. We found joy in the mundane, the shared meals, the quiet evenings, the laughter that bubbled up unexpectedly. It was a love that didn't demand perfection, but welcomed imperfections with open arms. The kind of love that grows deeper in the everyday, in the knowing glances and the unspoken support. There were moments when the weight of life's realities pressed upon us, health scares, moments of doubt, the inevitable challenges that come with age, but these were met not with despair, but with resilience, fueled by the knowledge that we faced them together. The fear that had once gripped June during that stormy night was no longer a barrier, but a reminder of the strength she possessed. And my presence, steady and unwavering, became a source of comfort rather than obligation. Together, we created a safe harbor in a world that often felt unpredictable. Our families noticed the change too. June's sister remarked on the lightness in her voice, the sparkle in her eyes that had returned after so many years. My own friends saw the difference in my demeanor, the way I smiled more freely, the warmth that now colored my interactions. It was clear that this connection had transformed us both, offering healing and hope in equal measure. We became a testament to the idea that love, no matter when it arrives, can reshape lives and rewrite stories. Looking back, I often think about that night, the phone call that shattered the silence of a storm and set everything in motion. It was a moment of vulnerability and courage, a call for help that turned into an invitation for something unexpected and beautiful. It taught me that sometimes the most profound connections come when we least expect them, and that answering the call can lead to life-changing experiences. June and I became living proof that it's never too late to find companionship, to trust again, and to open one's heart to possibility. As I sit here now, watching June tend to the garden we planted together, I am filled with a deep sense of peace. The storm has passed, the sky is clear, and the future stretches out before us full of promise, hope, and the quiet strength that comes from shared experience. Our story is not about grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but about the steady, patient growth of love and friendship in the face of life's storms. It is a reminder that even in the darkest nights, a single call, a single act of kindness, can change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.